homeostasis is the key term that applies to every body system. It's the main goal of the body, is to maintain this state of well-being, essentially. So you don't have a fever, you don't have high blood pressure, low blood pressure, blood sugar is stable, all enzymes are functioning properly, metabolism is okay. We call that homeostasis. So Walter Cannon, back in the early 20th century, called it the wisdom of the body. And it's really a key description and well phrased, I think, because the body is very keen at being able to adjust things to keep us stable. If we get too hot, how does the body respond to cool us down? Sweating. If we get too cold, how does the body respond? Shiver. If we're low on oxygen because we're starting to exercise, what does the body do? Heavy breathing. What? Yeah, pump our blood a little faster, harder, so heart rate increases, right? So we have this ability to get things back to normal, to meet the needs of every cell. So the literal translation of homeostasis is unchanging. Now, when we say that, we have to keep in mind that there's narrow limits with this unchanging state of being. So if I took everybody's temperature right now, not everybody would be 98.6. And how many of you in here are nurses' aides? Anybody? Good number of you. Good, because you can share some stories when it comes time for that. When you take the temperature of your patients, sometimes they're 90, especially the elderly, they're a little lower than that, aren't they? Like 97.4. Did you ever take temperatures of your patients? Do they allow that? Some do. 93? Oh my gosh, that's a little on the low side. Yikes. Wow. Yeah, that's really low. Yeah. Wow. Well, that's outside the normal range, but typically there's a range, right? So like if we look at blood pH, 7.35 to 7.45. So we can fluctuate within there, but we want to be within that range before the body's going to kick in and say, okay, we need to fix something and get back in that narrow range. So when we say it's unchanging, we say that with a little side note that within narrow limits, just like blood pressure. Blood pressure, my blood pressure is always really low. Another person is always maybe 129, which is still within the normal range. So again, there's limits and there's variations within the individual, like the person that Emily's talking about. That's her normal. So sometimes we have new normals when there's other conditions going on in the body. So today we're going to talk about the different parts of feedback systems that maintain this homeostasis. So in the PowerPoint here, we see there's a variable, a sensor, an integrator, and an effector. And it's a continuous loop. Notice the arrows go in a circle. So the variable is something that is changing in the body, right? It varies, variable. So here's an example of some variables. Gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide are really critical. Waste products, pH, electrolytes, temperature, volume, and pressure, all those things are varying on a minute-to-minute basis in the body. And if something is happening in the body that causes them to go outside that narrow limit, then we have these mechanisms that take over. So what is the mechanism that takes over? Well, the sensor, so in this diagram, the variable is the factor. So a sensor is a cell in the body that's sensing a change. Okay, so it's sensing some change that's happening in the body. For example, if we're looking at blood pressure, in the lower example, we're taking these generic terms in the top diagram and looking at the bottom diagram. If blood pressure is the variable that's increasing, there are receptor cells in our carotid arteries in our neck. And if someone has really high blood pressure, their vessels are going to bulge, and those sensors are going to say, blood pressure's too high in this vessel. And as a result, that impulse, those sensors in the carotid arteries are going to send an impulse to the brain. And the brain, most often the hypothalamus part of the brain, but I don't expect you to know the parts of the brain yet. We didn't even talk about that, so just know brain, is going to tell the body to decrease the heart rate to lower that pressure. Because if you have a fast heart rate and high pressure, that's really hard on the body. That's hard on the tissues to be forcing that blood into those tissues. So we want to slow that heart rate down, reduce the blood pressure. So the brain is called the integrating center. So the integrating center is the boss. It's getting this information and saying, okay, we've got too high of a blood pressure, let's do something about it. Or if it's in the narrow limit, the brain's going to say, we're good, we're not going to do anything different. So the brain, if the blood pressure is too high, is going to send an impulse, a nerve impulse, to an effector cell. And an effector cell are the cells that are going to change that blood pressure. So what would change that blood pressure? There's cells in the heart that are going to beat slower as a result of this information coming from the integrating center, and it's going to lower that blood pressure. So we can think of this in an everyday example. Let's say you have a phone call comes in to the secretary saying that we need more of these parts. Let's say we need more catalytic converters for the Ford Escape. Secretary hears that from the field, customers, buyers are saying we need more catalytic converters ASAP for the Ford Escape. So the secretary tells the foreman on the line, tell your people we need more catalytic converters for the Ford Escape. So the foreman on the line tells the assembly line workers, speed up the production of catalytic converters. Don't do the other parts, work on catalytic converters today. So then catalytic converters get made, they get shipped out, and the buyer is happy. So who is the secretary in this feedback mechanism? What? The sensor. The foreman, who the secretary calls, is the integrating center and decides, do we really need more catalytic converters? Is based on what's coming out today? Yeah. And then the assembly line workers are going to make more catalytic converters, the effector cells. And then that's a feedback loop, right? As long as there's enough catalytic converters being shipped out to the buyers, everybody's happy. But if the shipment is low again, then the loop starts. So we use this for controlling blood sugar, blood pressure, temperature, anything that is a variable that can be measured in the body. And those of you that are going into the nursing or healthcare profession, you have job security because disease is a result of broken feedback mechanisms. So something in that loop is broken. So let's talk about high blood pressure. So what happens with high blood pressure is the sensor works, the integrating center works, but the effector cells are having a hard time. For example, another effector cell for lowering blood pressure is to dilate the vessels. So decrease in the heart rate is one way to lower blood pressure, but at the same time, we also dilate the vessels. But we can't dilate a vessel over the heart if it's narrowed and full of cholesterol, can we? No. So for that reason, blood pressure always stays up. So what we can do is give someone a blood pressure pill and lower the blood vessel, or dilate the blood vessels all over the body, and that's going to lower blood pressure. Even though those ones over the heart aren't going to open up as well, we can give a medicine to just maximize the dilation of those blood vessels so they always stay open. Because some feedback mechanisms, if they continue and continue, the sensor no longer senses a change and it just kind of shuts down. That's another way that disease sets in, is they no longer change or no longer send information to the brain to make a change. So what do we do in healthcare? We provide medicines to overcome broken feedback mechanisms to help those effectors. So there's two types of mechanisms or feedback systems. The most common is a negative feedback, which means that my factor, my blood pressure, is like a teeter-totter. So if blood pressure gets too high, we go through this loop, and at the end, blood pressure is low. Right? So the beginning, it's high. At the end, it's low. Or the other way around. If my temperature is too low, feedback mechanism kick in, and at the end, my temperature is high. So the variable is changed in the opposite direction when we have negative feedback. So when you hear the word negative, don't think it's bad, because it's actually good. It maintains homeostasis. Negative is what we want. Negative feedback is what we want. So again, examples, we talked about blood pressure. This is an example of body temperature. That's the variable. Nerve receptors in the skin say, oh, it's cold outside. We're getting colder and colder and colder. Let's send this information to the brain. And the brain's going to say it's too cold. This is below normal. So we're going to activate the muscles to shiver. And when the muscles contract in these tiny little tight contractions, that creates heat, and that raises our body temperature. But when you get to the point of shivering, that doesn't last very long, right? You shouldn't be shivering for hours and hours, right? That's a temporary thing. But after a while, that temperature is going to fall too low, and then our enzymes don't function anymore, and then a person dies of hypothermia, and cells start to die. So people that have frostbite, for example, that can continue, and then you don't have any more toes. Like that couple that went hiking. There was a movie on it. What was that movie where the couple with the baby went hiking and the guy walked back to go get help, and I forget. It was a young couple, and or were they driving in the car? That's what it was. Yeah, he was driving in the snowstorm, yeah. Right, and they lost, did the baby die? I think it was kind of a happy ending, but they were missing toes at the end. Yeah. So anyway, so the muscles kick in. That's the effector, and then it raises body temperature. So that's an example of negative feedback. Now, positive feedback is another system where we have the same parts. We've got the variable, the integrator, the variable, the sensor, the integrator, and the effector, but the response is not opposite. So if labor contractions are starting, their labor contractions are increasing, when it goes through a positive feedback, the body responds by increasing contractions even more. So that's not like a teeter-totter effect, right? It's happening in the same direction. So if you think of positive feedback, just think of it, it's pushing the variable in some direction, in the same direction, to accomplish something for the body. So it's not homeostasis, but it's accomplishing some positive thing for the body. For example, labor contractions are an example. So when the baby starts to descend on down the birth canal and the head presses up against the cervix, it releases oxytocin from the brain, not from the brain, from the posterior pituitary, and that releases oxytocin into the blood, and that oxytocin causes uterine contractions, which causes the baby to press against the cervix more, which stimulates the posterior pituitary to release more oxytocin. So we have this cycle going, contractions leading to oxytocin, causing more contractions until baby's born. So that's what it's trying to accomplish, is we're increasing contractions to get baby down the birth canal and out. Same thing with lactation. When baby suckles on the breast, that releases oxytocin, which causes milk letdown, and the more baby suckles, the more letdown, and milk flows. Milk keeps flowing until baby's done. Again, it's a positive feedback. Lactation continues and continues and continues through this feedback until baby's full. Blood clotting. When you cut yourself, it causes platelets to gather at the site that leak out of the broken capillaries, and they release factors to cause more platelets to come and more platelets to come, which will eventually clot off and bridge that torn vessel and heal that injury. So again, it's a positive feedback cycle. So positive feedback does not maintain homeostasis, but it accomplishes some task. So here's just an example of a baby pressing against the cervix, stimulating nerves in the cervix. So that would be what part of our feedback system? The sensor, yeah, the sensor, and that goes to the brain, which is the integrator. And what is the effector cell? The pituitary gland is going to secrete oxytocin. So the cells that are going to respond to this nerve impulse with the help of the brain tells pituitary gland, right? So these are like the assembly line workers in my example of the catalytic converter. So the pituitary gland is going to secrete oxytocin, which is going to cause more contractions, okay? In the healthcare environment, we call oxytocin, the laboratory-made oxytocin, we call it pitocin. And you may have heard of that. And people say, oh, she's going for an induction. Well, the induction is this pharmaceutical oxytocin called Pitocin. They just put it in the IV, and they give it a little bit at a time, a little bit of it at a time, because you don't want to stress baby, but it causes those mild contractions. And sometimes it's enough if a woman is overdue, for example, by a couple of days or even a week or two. Sometimes that's enough to get this process kicked in and started, and the mother will produce her own oxytocin, and it'll kick her into labor. Other people have these long labors. If you've heard of people, oh, she was in labor, or yourselves, you're in labor for 24 or 36 hours, because it's just that positive feedback cycle isn't kicking in, so we just keep adding it artificially. We keep providing the oxytocin in slowly higher and higher doses until baby's born. So some questions then I want to ask you are, I'm going to provide an example of a feedback system, and then you tell me what it is. And there's a worksheet on that I'll show you here. It'll be in another link on Blackboard.